And we have in our next session with Rose Gupta, who will be presenting her paper on binding oneself, unintegrated states, and a frantic search for an object, any object. I will read you the short bio or Rose's bio. So Rose Gupta, LCSW, PsyD, is a psychoanalyst, clinical social worker, instructor, an international speaker and consultant with a diverse, multicultural private practice spanning the tech industry in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. Her papers focus on negation of trauma, intersubjectivity, unrepresented states, and an internal object without representation. She's a graduate member of PINC, Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California. She has presented her work at conferences and seminars at IPA, IARPP, International Sander Ferenczi Network, International Psychohistorical Association, IPHA, Northern California Society for Psychoanalytic Psychology, NCSPP, and the Psychotherapy Institute at Berkeley. Rose, take it on.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. The title of my paper is Binding Oneself, Unintegrated States, and a Frantic Search for an Object, any object. This is an inquiry into contemporary disorders of being. This paper explores the premise that there exists in the human psyche an unconscious and omnipresent relationship between primal unintegrated states of mind and an ongoing and often desperate search for an object to provide a binding together of oneself. At this most fundamental stage of existence, the more frantic the experience of internal fragmentation and lack of cohesion, the greater the unintegrated self is in search of any cohering other, and the profound relief when found in heading off disintegration and psychic death. Winnicott describes the experience of psychic trauma and ensuing fragmentation with the failure of the, quote, good enough parents to hold the baby together when internal disruptions like hunger or fear occur. Instead, he calls it a false self. I would call it a protective functional self, emerges to adapt to the parent's needs while protecting the child's true self from annihilation. At this level of survival, the quality of the subjectivity of the binding, cohering other is secondary to the desperate need to be saved. Fortuitously, if the binding other is integrated and evolved, then the ensuing relationship is empathic and life-affirming. Conversely, if the binding other is damaged and corrupted, then the cost of rescue is the repetition of domination and submission throughout the life cycle. Thomas Ogden described this non-symbolic, unintegrated state. He called it the autistic contiguous position, where the infant feels its existence through bodily sensations. So disruptions in somatic existence and the failure of empathic interventions by caregivers result in feelings of terror and disintegration. Due to the fluidity of this position, when we experience this state of mind, we are already fully immersed into sensations of annihilation and non-existence. To this point, I refer us to Robert Lifton in 1961. who studied social phenomena from a psychological lens and who concluded, quote, what humans desperately seek in times of external dislocation, which of course is what we're experiencing in this country, is a societal belief system which offers fixity and absoluteness, and that it is shaped and delineated by a single ideology he termed totalism. In his case studies of one such system, thought reform, at that time he was studying, during the Chinese Cultural Revolution of the 1950s, he applied the key characteristics that emerged from this study to a more general application of closed systems of thought where violence is justified for a higher purpose. It is for your own good. My purpose here is not a commentary on political ideology, but an analytic observation of the perverse forms of abuse when power is grossly asymmetrical. An example in Lifton's case interview with a Dr. Vincent, who was a survivor of incarceration during this time, the physical and verbal abuse he endured when he was arrested was justified as necessary for his own good. His reality as a person, quote, his reality as innocent of crimes against the state was met with violence. There was only one reality of the prevailing group mind, that he was guilty and that he was responsible for his own plight. Dr. Vincent said, when interviewed later after he was released, he said, you are exhausted, you are annihilated, exhausted, and you do whatever they want. You begin to believe all this. Analytically, he is describing an identification with the aggressor, a la Ferenczi in 1932. For survival, he has internalized the corrupt binding other and became what they want. He also became a corrupt binding self, like his persecutors, and with his cohorts, tormented the new crop of prisoners, an identification with the aggressor as the aggressor. According to Dr. Vincent, upon release, you find yourself in two political realities at the same time. This external manifestation reflects an internal world in fragments. The self is negated by a corrupted binding other when annihilation is masked behind a facade of good intentions and moral justifications. As we know, many unexamined, single-leaning ideologies can be found worldwide in familial, cultural, religious, and political narratives. Who is to be included? Who is to be excluded? Who is to be valued? And what is to be discarded, negated, and dehumanized? This shared external human need for absoluteness, especially in times of dislocation, results in unconscious group collusions. That is, the health of a societal collective collusion is determined by the greater or lesser instability of each individual psyche and by the level of each person's grasping for meaning and containment. I am taken with this notion of a totalistic societal belief system that is perceived by its members to offer containment in times of crisis. From a psychoanalytic perspective, I view this social construct as an external collective binding object that is internalized and is in relationship with each individual's unintegrated self. From a relational perspective, contemporary disorders, due to disruptions to a sense of existence, result in a psyche comprised of multiple self states and are also found in the psychic repertoire amongst high functioning people. This unintegrated self and binding object configuration is one of multiple self and object representations that carry different life experiences. Now, let's return to the beginning of life, when our very existence comes into being. I refer us to Beatrice Beebe in 2004 in her poignant paper, Faces in Relation. In this paper, she describes her patient Dolores, a high-functioning person who has nevertheless lost her face. Throughout her treacherous journey of recovery, and aided by videotape microanalyses of their interactions, we come to understand Dolores's search for her lost face through the binding gaze of Dr. Beebe. Dolores's tenuous grasp with going on being fluctuates internally by a psyche that contains three mothers: the lost good foster mother, the abusive biological mother, the abusive bad biological mother, and a benign but absent adoptive mother. We can say Dolores suffers from the trauma of not being found. In her own words, Dolores tells us, quote, "I can't find the good face anymore. I felt it in my molecules and how it tells me I am. The good face doesn't come back to get me because she knows I was bad." I think of Dolores as heroic, as she struggled mightily not to be convinced by the abusive binding mother into believing she is all bad, and putting herself at risk in perpetuating that legacy. From a relational psychoanalytic perspective, I posit that an infant's mind is developed in between the intersubjective space shared by mother and child. It is here the very sense of existence emerges. A sense of self and a sense of value is potentially formed. Beebe's emphasis on this, she calls the mutual bidirectional influence, and she terms this the dialogic origin of the mind. Powerful, powerful words. A collapse of this intersubjective space in the pre-verbal, unsymbolized psyche early in life results in a psychic catastrophe I reference as disorders of being. This is an unrepresented state of mind disrupted by trauma and characterized by dissociation, vulnerability, and internal disbursement. It is accompanied by feelings of negation and an experience of non-existence or non-being. Where there is no internalized mirror or good face to find one's own face, the psyche, in order to feel real, will seek fixity and absoluteness from a promising face at any cost. Ferenczi understood trauma as interpersonal and as anarchy. He writes in his clinical diaries in 1932, quote, In the bodily sphere, this might mean an anarchy of the organs, parts and elements of organs, whose reciprocal cooperation renders life possible. In the psychic sphere, the intruding force produces a kind of explosion. My clinical experience with many of my patients, I have observed that the binding other, as I think of this particular self and object relationship, is in a timeless relationship with the unintegrated self in the pre-symbolic, unrepresented states of mind. An empathic binding other is part of a secure psychic scaffolding, and the self is blessed with a high bottom during times of stress. Conversely, a corrupted binding object, internalized, precipitates a psychic freefall. I am also drawn to Esther Bick, who wrote in 1967. I love her paper, it's very brief, it's beautiful. She writes, at its most primitive form, parts of the personality are felt to have no binding force amongst themselves. This internal function of containing parts of the self is dependent initially on the interjection of an external object experienced as capable of fulfilling this function. However, what I want to emphasize is that the introjection of a negative binding other is in a constant state of annihilation of the unintegrated self. Because of its pre-symbolic existence, the introjection is felt but not thought. It can be found in states of depression, anxiety, somatic disturbances, and projections. Bick observes, quote, the need for a containing object would seem at the infantile unintegrated state to produce a frantic search for an object which can hold the attention and thereby be experienced momentarily at least as holding parts of the personality together. As a case study, I'm referring us not to a patient of mine, but I'm referring us to the timeless story of Billy Budd, the novel Billy Budd, and his sailing vessel, the Indomitable, as a metaphor and external representation of a binding containing other at the societal level. While Herman Melville's novel, written in 1924, takes place during the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 through 1815, the human dynamics and relentless historical repetitions are applicable to any era. At the most concrete level, this is a story of a young British sailor essentially forced onto a battleship in need of more manpower from a hijacked merchant vessel called the Rights of Man. We learned from Billy that he was orphaned as a child and had no one and no place he called home. As he settled willingly into the ship's life at sea, he became equally beloved by his fellow sailors, who called him affectionately their handsome sailor. The fateful exception was the fearful John Claggart, second in command, who felt an instant visceral antagonism towards Billy. The reader is left with an anticipatory foreboding that materializes. Ultimately, Claggart falsely accuses Billy of instigating a mutiny. Speechless and with uncharacteristic rage, Billy punches him with a blow so severe it kills him. Captain Veer, who once showed tolerance and affection towards Billy, cannot stand the idea of Claggart implicating him in fomenting a non-existent mutiny. With all rationality gone and filled with the unthinkable, he relies on martial law that necessitates a verdict of guilty as charged. Billy is hung the next day. However, this is more than a story of a sailor falsely accused and executed. The impossible to conquer warship, Indomitable, with its magnificent sails unfurled at sea, is at war with the French and facing imminent death and destruction. It might as well be called the ship of totalism. The group mind on board embraced a shared singular belief system served up to them of moral superiority that justified and thus rationalized their willingness to die for their king, the good binding object, I believe. The entire social system also served as an internalized collective binding object and provided the men with cohesion, fixity, and absoluteness that glued their unintegrated selves together as they faced possible annihilation at sea. They quote, "Long live our captain, here's to our navy, long live our sovereign, we're for the king." This system also provided an external human receptacle for all the participants to evacuate their unwanted, devalued, violent, and violated selves into. Quote, "The French are bold enemies. They want all the world to be slaves. They have enslaved their neighbors and killed their king. Down with the Frenchies." Sailor Billy Budd, as the abandoned baby, represents goodness and is someone his mates recognize as uncorrupted. To the father of his new family, Captain Veer, he declares his undying love. "I'll follow you, I'll serve you, I'm yours, I'll die for you." The master at arms, Claggart, in his own words, describes to us in chilling terms, like no other I have ever encountered, the composition of his psyche, one devoid of conscience and instead as a black hole filled of hate. He directs his associations to Billy Budd. He says, and I find it very poignant, very poignant. He's talking about Billy Budd. "Oh, beauty, oh, handsomeness, goodness. Would that I had never encountered you. Would that I lived in my own world always, in that depravity to which I was born. There I establish an order such as reigns in hell. The light shines in the darkness, comprehends it, and suffers. I am doomed to annihilate you. With hate and envy, I am stronger than love." Then there is Captain Veer, who, as witness to the destruction of goodness and innocence, and as a higher authority who has the power to interpret reality and mete out justice, succumbs to his own internal terrors and colludes with the negation of goodness. Quote, "How can I save him? It is not his trial, it is mine. Mine. It is I whom the devil awaits." Almost done here. On the metaphoric ship of totalism, external closed systems of thought foreclose forming one's own subjectivity through self-knowledge. Instead, the silent catastrophe hides an intrapsychic world that is in fragments. From Billy Budd to Captain Veer, Master at Arms, Claggart, to Captain Veer, Master-at-Arms Claggart, shipmates, all reflect varying degrees of internalizing a binding object. For some, any object, even a corrupt object, to catch their fall. Later in life, Captain Veer writes, I am an old man who has experienced much. Much good has been shown to me, and much evil. Oh, what have I done? So much is confusion. I have been lost in the infinite sea. Analysts, in conclusion, analysts living in between with patients will recognize the disruptive encounters with the negating, binding other and put words to the experience in order to facilitate the movement from unrepresented to represented states, from darkness to self-awareness. Then goodness has a chance. That's it.
Thank you, Rose.